So we're live. I'm here with Chris Ye. Chris is one of the world's most famous investors. His book, Blitzscaling, was co-authored with Reid Hoffman, who's the founder of LinkedIn. The foreword was written by Bill Gates, and taught at Stanford, Harvard, Yale, and all other top business schools. So, hi, Chris.
Hey, Julien. It's great to see you.
So this is our kind of like prep live stream. So what we're going to do is just like discuss the topic, and
I actually have no idea what the topic is today, so this is good preparation.
Yeah, I'm trying to make things like, well, we're screwing around with or playing around, or Schloke is taking ownership of the content, so we're changing things. But I'm trying to make things more simple.
Okay. Simple is good.
So what we're going to do is just talk through the topic, and then also, and then after we'll record the episode. So the topic is really, or what I'm trying to understand for me, is how to think about when I should be working on solutions versus problems. And I think that's rooted in, so mostly what I've been doing for the last month or so is doing interviews with people who have problems that I'm interested in, and mostly trying to like understand their problem.
Right.
And in parallel, I kind of created this GitHub repository where I track like versions of, lightweight business ideas, really for the purpose of guiding my exploration of problems, right? And then so part of the question is, or part of like the reason why this is top of mind for me is like, how much time should I be investing into creating those solutions versus discovering the problem? And then the other, motivating factor for me thinking about this is I just have like a bias to do things. So I kind of intrinsically feel that I should be, executing in some way, which, and it's not that I'm not, but I'm also kind of not. So yeah, that's kind of where I'm coming from. And I'll let you kind of riff off that.
Yeah. So, what the approach I would take is to frame it in the context of design thinking, which is something I know very well, having studied it at Stanford with my advisor, David Kelly, the founder of IDEO and the founder of the D School. And the whole thing about design thinking is that we view it as an entire process, and each step along the way is an important part of the process. You just can't skip over it. And so we begin with research, which is what you've been doing. And research is doing something. It's not just preparatory work. It's the actual work that needs to be done in order to be successful. So doing the research to truly understand the problem is really critical. And then once you research, you actually need to define the problem, because research is not just, oh, I'm going to go out there with a problem hypothesis and see if people agree or not. It's talking to people and following up on the sort of funny things they say that don't quite make sense, and doing all this stuff in order to uncover perhaps hidden ideas, hidden thoughts, hidden needs. And then from there, you actually refine the problem. And so you need to actually come up with a problem statement. And defining that problem can take a while as well, because you're going to do a lot of different versions of it. And it's only after you've actually defined the problem that you then ideate the various solutions. Now, as you go along, you may come up with solutions in your mind. It may just be that you're looking at a problem and boom, the solution comes to mind. Great. Write that down. Do what you do. Create a repository, write down that idea. But the fact that the idea came to you easily doesn't mean it's a better idea. It just means it came to you easily. So write down that idea, but then go through a systematic process of ideation after that. And with the ideation, what you're doing is you're coming up with a whole long list of basic, like you said, high level ideas and ways that you might solve this. Try to come up with as many different directions as possible. I actually have some old brainstorming exercises I would use to help me come up with ideas. Basically, it's a series of verbs that force you to think about different ways to do things, like reverse and backwards and up, down. There's all sorts of different words. And once you have that constraint, it can often help you come up with new ideas. We were obviously thinking about it from the perspective of mechanical designs, but I think it would apply to business processes as well. And then finally, after you've ideated and come up with a whole bunch of different ideas, you then refine them, perhaps by talking with other people, perhaps just by looking at them on your own to figure out which ones you want to execute on. All that work that you do before executing is not wasted. It's an important part of the process to allow you to make sure you're tackling the right problem with the right approach.
And so one of the things I've been finding is, or thinking about, is that often when it comes to businesses, right,
Mm-hmm.
there are multiple people who, like multiple types of people who have different types of problems,
Right.
right? So I watched this talk from James Courier, who was one of our guests, and the way he he uses this term of like hidden marketplaces, and he advocating for people like build businesses that don't seem like marketplace businesses into marketplaces. But the kind of like underlying reality there is that there are multiple people involved and they all have different problem sets. So what I'm getting at is that the solution to the problem uncovers other people who have other problems that I need to understand. So like,
Mm-hmm.
so like in a certain way, the solution ideation is necessary to the problem discovery. I don't know. Like it's kind
Yeah,
of like a
no,
really raw
that's
thought.
fine. And it's an iterative process. So that's the other thing I probably should have mentioned. Design thinking is always iterative. So you come up with some idea, you research, you define a problem, you ideate, you come up with a solution, you explore that solution, you discover that that solution requires other things. So you go back, you research, you define the problem, you ideate. So you may repeat this multiple times, and you may have to do it recursively, as you just indicated. But the whole point is it is a process, a systematic process that you can always fall back on. Now, of course, maybe you have inspiration and you just suddenly, as they often like to write about in these business books, suddenly you go ahead and you write something down on a napkin and boom, that's it. That's the $1 billion idea. Great if it happens. But if that doesn't happen, well, having a process will allow you to keep moving forward and keep grinding away in a more effective way than just sort of like sitting there staring at a blank page.
So what, like when we discuss this with, or when you discuss this with Dan Lewis,
Mhm.
it seems to me like maybe it's because his I didn't do the discussion, but my impression of the episode or the interview was that he had a relatively good sense of who the people were and like a ballpark what the area of research would be, and then he went into it, talked to people, defined the problem with them.
Yes.
Is that how it should be?
Well,
And
you have to start with some sort of inkling or hypothesis, because otherwise, how do you pick where to begin? Right? Something causes you to pick some group of people to focus on or some set of problems to focus on. There's an intuition involved. But as you go through and you iterate, you develop enough information to then decide, is that intuition right or wrong? Do I want to study more or do I want to try something else?
and then but so I guess, should it, like the impression I got from Dan was that it feels as if he, you know, found a bunch of useful problems pretty easily doing that, um, and was able to like create a useful solution without going through like a ton of iterations. But maybe it's because he,
Well,
didn't want to bore us
that's
with all
you're
the
telling a
details.
story, right? You're telling a story. I mean, if you ask Dan, how long did that take? And he might say, oh, it took about 3 or 4 months. All right. Well, it took him 3 minutes to tell the story. So obviously there was a lot more going on. There was a lot more work involved. It's just that you can define it, and that's actually fine, right? This is the old saying: if you have a map with a one-to-one scale, it's not actually useful, right? Oh, here's the map to the country. It's the same size as the country. That doesn't do me any good. You have to abridge somehow.
So kind of like Dan did go through a lot of, and it's not just Dan, like generally when you hear people talk about this stuff, like the reason why it feels like they're not going through a bunch of different iterations is that it would just be too boring to go
Yeah.
through all the iterations that they tell you about it.
This is also why I often tell people, and I think we discussed this somewhere else, not to show your work, right? In other words, you have work. If somebody asks to see it, you should show it to them. But just the effort alone, nobody else cares, nor is it interesting.
So something else that I've been doing as a learning experience has been, so I'm doing these, interviews, just like talking to people
Mm-hmm.
and asking them questions. And like, I try to kind of like, ask them questions, or I'm trying to discover problems, but are like related to actual things that they've done or that they are doing. Right. So I'm trying to like refer to actual things. Like, why do you do this? And trying
Right.
to, and like, why do you feel this way about this specific reality that
By the
you're
way,
in?
one of the things that I learned when I was getting my training as a counselor is, I know Simon Sinek says always ask why, but people don't like why questions. Tell me about your reasons for doing this. What was going through your mind when you made this decision? As opposed to saying why? Because why does seem controversial, confrontational.
Okay. So, but one of the things that's been really helpful, I think, or that I'm like doing a little bit of, and maybe is like generating situations that
Mm-hmm.
would be that would enable me to learn,
Mm-hmm.
right? And
Expand on that. What do you mean by you're generating situations? You're generating hypotheticals and taking people through them, or you're actually,
no,
there and working with them on something?
like yeah, actually like creating a actual sort of situation in real life. So I'll give you an example. I'm trying to learn about how senior developers think about junior developers.
Mm-hmm.
So CS students, let's say, or anybody that's like very junior. And what I did is I got my friend who's a very senior developer to do a coding exercise with a CS student. And so I got the coding exercise, got the CS student. It's a really good opportunity for the CS students to get to know, a senior engineer at Google.
Right.
And then they're doing this exercise, and then that I'm going to listen in on their conversation afterwards, and I am then going to have a conversation with both of them to understand how, like, well, to understand the kind of like related problem. So for
Right.
example, I don't know what will come up. I might ask Paul, who's my friend, like, hey, um you know so he might say like, this guy is like the best. It's like, okay, so he's the best, so how rare is that? And it's like, oh, it's really rare. And it's like, well, what does it mean that it's really rare? And then maybe I'll uncover
Right.
some
That's
problems
right.
there or whatever.
Pull the threads, as I like to say.
But my question to you is, what is the, like, to a certain extent, like, this is building or kind of like doing, right, where I'm generating a real world event, which could happen through building a product or through offering a service.
Yeah.
and then trying to learn from that real world event.
Right.
Um, what's the like? How should I think about that?
Well, I think you should think about it as a way of doing research, just like any other. So, when you do research, you can learn in a variety of ways. You could learn by asking people questions, which is what most people think about. You could learn by observation, which I generally fit under the category of cultural anthropology. And what you're talking about is sort of a combination of cultural anthropology and experiment. You set up a set of circumstances as opposed to just sort of observing them in nature, but the way you gather information is more observational. You're not asking them a set of questions, you're watching them as they work and then interrogating them afterwards to understand what was going on in their minds. You might even stop in the middle and ask them, "Hey, I just saw you do this. What does that mean?" So I think it's a good way of doing things. I think it's a very smart way to understand a problem more deeply.
And so let's say I like how much of that should I be doing? So, for example, and like how should I decide when to use each different um uh technique? And I think in the end the actual answer is I should be taking all the available opportunities to learn.
Hmm.
So if they're
Hmm.
like I just like came up with it creatively because it occurred to me that I could set this up and it'd be a good learning experience,
Right.
so I did. So there's a kind of like pragmatic um like realities like it's not like if I want to interview like all the CTOs in the world, they're not going to talk to me. So I need to when I have the opportunity, I
Right.
do, and if I don't, I don't. Right. So it's part of that, but what else beyond just like pragmatism in jumping opportunities and creating all available opportunities to learn would shape my thinking around how and when to do this type of stuff.
Well, I think that the general principle would be get as close to nature as possible. And so the ideal would be to observe something real happening as it happens and be able to gather information from that. That's the closest you can get to the real thing. Then what you're talking about is something that's slightly detached from the real thing because you've set it up yourself, but still pretty good because you can get direct observation. And so it may be unnatural, but you have direct observation. The other opportunity is to interrogate people about something afterwards, which you're also doing. There, if you interrogate them about something that happened naturally, again, it's real data, but it is not through direct observation. Now it's through primary researchers asking someone questions. It's not quite as good. Basically, the ideal is as real as possible, as close to real time as possible, as observational as possible. And then you just try to approximate that as best you can, given the circumstances.
And then to like this does eventually kind of morph into creating solutions and then learning from those solutions, right?
Right,
Because
right. Because you're
like
going, it's an iterative process, right? You're going to run, you're going to create a solution, you're going to try it out. That may cause you to have new questions. You're going to research those questions. You're going to ideate around solutions to those questions. Again, this is a process you're going to follow over and over again, recursively, in and out. It's not like you do it once and you're done.
yeah, because like there's no real clear line between research and product, right? Because even when let's say a dedicated when we were building and selling, I mean those research, right? Like I
That's right.
actually considered it as primarily research. Like that's why I was so involved in sales because that enabled me to learn.
Right.
And when we would ship product, I would try to learn about, and I'd observe. We'd have data, and we're trying to learn. So it's not like there's a barrier between research and execution, but there is a qualitative difference between what I'm doing today versus what we are doing at dedicated. How would you think about that? I'm
Well,
not
the
sure
key
where
the
that
key
leads.
difference is not in the activity. The key difference is what you view as the most important output of that activity. So during the research phase, the most important output of the activity is information, and it's gathering new information that really matters. In a situation where you've already got a business that you've defined and you're trying to scale up your sales, of course, the information is still important. You want to collect it, but the more important information that you're getting out of it is not the details and the observations, but rather how effective are we at driving to a close? What's our conversion rate? How do we improve our sales cycle and make it even less? And so it's a question of what you're looking for. Right? In one case, you're just very open-endedly looking for whatever information you can. And in another case, you're saying, hey, this is a production process and we're measuring out how effective it is. And what we're trying to gather is a data to make it even more effective.
So is it fair to say that, you could bucket what you're doing as a business or as an entrepreneur into what you're doing when the most important output of your activity is learning, and
Yeah,
then what you're doing, the most important output of your activity are results.
that's right.
And the kind of when it is results, that is when you should be, building a team, spending money, raising money, whatever, like whatever it is.
Right.
And when you're mostly looking to learn, you're trying to stay like, maximally nimble, like not have time constraints. You're just like execute a much more kind of creative and less kind of conscientious.
Well, for
Um,
example, you're going to focus on the learning. So when you were conducting a sales call for dedicated, would you ever stop in the middle and say, hold on for a second, let's start over? Or
but
let's
no,
pause. Let's
you're
stop talking about the product. I want to understand what was going on in your mind just then. You wouldn't.
yeah, and then that tells me that I am building a business that I should be, expending resources to obtain the results.
Right. Now, again, it's not a firm dividing line. It may be that, as you're going through and trying to sell, you encounter something unusual. And you may say, huh, I need to shift into learning mode here because this could be important. Or you could, gather information for your salespeople and sort of be on the lookout for some sort of anomaly. And again, whenever you find an anomaly or whenever you find an opportunity, you need to shift into learning mode. But it's also, a continuum, right? You may not shift all the way to the learning mode where you are saying, well, stop, let's start over again, or, hold on for a second, tell me exactly what was going on in your mind, because that may not be appropriate in a sales relationship.
And so while I am in learning mode, I should be trying to, learn in a manner that is as, where I'm learning as much as possible in the least amount of time as possible,
Yes.
where I am managing my own psychology so that
Right.
I'm not getting, overly committed to things like that's it's like,
Yeah, so let's talk about that for a second. The model I would use is you're always looking for ROI. It's just the R and the I are different. When you're in learning mode, the R is equal to the learning, and the I is not so much, man hours or resources as it is elapsed time, because that's the thing you're trying to do. You're trying to learn as quickly as possible, and that's on calendar time. However, when you're selling, the ROI is measured by revenue, cash, or contracts, and investment is measured by the amount of time expended and the amount of resources expended, because there your goal is to deliver a multiple of revenue in comparison to the costs.
So fundamentally, the difference is like I do not want to be in a position where I am trying to learn like I'm primarily trying to learn, but I am expending resources that are not just calendar days. Like that is the thing that kills you.
I mean, there may even be time when you expend resources other than calendar days in order to reduce the number of calendar days. This is just a reflection of the fact that that's the scarcest resource. That's ultimately the resource. You're in learning mode. You're trying to get through learning as quickly as possible. You may make decisions in some cases where you can spend a little money to chop off time, or there are other cases where you're like, no, that's not worth the cost. So, but the primary measure is the time. How quickly can you learn?
And so if I feel, let's say that, say, building a simple product that I can just throw together in 2 days, let's say, or a week or whatever. So, and if I feel that would be the way for me to learn most about something,
That's fine.
That's fine. So the means of like the activity that you do for learning can be to sell, it can be to build, it can be to create situations like I did. The actual difference between the two modes is that in results mode, you're looking for results, primarily
Right.
revenue growth.
That's right. Exactly. And again, your objective in learning mode is ultimately to drive revenue growth. It's just you're trying to learn the things that will be required to allow you to generate the revenue someday. It's a very long-term point of view.
Okay, and then okay, let's do the kind of like recording thing.
All right.
Do you have
Sounds good.
15 minutes?
Yeah. Let me get a little bit of water first because I want to make sure
Yeah.
my voice holds up throughout. I'll be right back. So I have as glasses these stainless steel sort of tumblers or carafes. They're insulated and dishwasher safe, which makes them very good for anything other than microwaving.
Do they make noise? And do they break?
They don't break because they're made out of stainless
Yeah.
steel. And I don't know, they don't make much noise, I suppose. I mean, again, you could actually tap them, but they're not going to be like a bit of glass or crystal.
I had these in my apartment in Istanbul.
Mm.
I had these really nice plates, and they were kind of like handmade, porcelain plates.
Yep.
And uh, when they make them like handmade, they can make them like really thin. But sometimes they would like every couple of months it would just like crack in two because it was like
Yeah.
super
There's two, yeah,
thin.
exactly. I prefer strong things. It's easier to deal with. Even if things are inexpensive, the fact that they're lost still, it's a bit of sadness, a little emotional pop, if you will.
Yeah, we only had two plates, so when they break, it was a problem. We just didn't have much stuff. Okay, so
All
I'll
right, let's do it.
do a pause and then reintroduce you.
You got it.
So welcome to Blitzscaling Yourself. I'm with Chris Ye, and my name is Julien Newman. Chris is one of the world's most famous investors. His book, Blitzscaling, was co-authored with Reid, the founder of LinkedIn, and the foreword was written by Bill Gates. Chris's book is taught at all business schools, Harvard, Stanford, Yale, Princeton, etc. So welcome, Chris.
It's great to be back, Julien. I was away in Bangkok, so I apologize for not being able to be here last week, but it's good to be back.
And unfortunately, I was in Bangkok a few days before you got there, and the stars did not align.
Well, how long are you going to be in Taipei for?
1 or 2 months.
I was going to say I might be passing through Taipei in November, but that will be too far away.
Yeah, this is sad reality of our lives. So, Chris, one of the challenges, or one of the things that's top of mind for me as I'm discovering what I can build as a next business, or what's the idea that would get me really excited, is thinking about whether I should be creating solutions or whether I should be discovering problems. And you have a different structure, or different two buckets.
Yes.
Your buckets are you primarily in learning mode, or are you primarily in results mode? And I'll let you unpack that.
Absolutely. So, a lot of this comes from my training in design thinking. I studied product design as an undergraduate at Stanford. My undergrad advisor was David Kelly, the founder and CEO of IDEO. And so I got a good dose of design thinking at a young age. And what we learn in design thinking is that there is an entire process to coming up with solutions to problems. And every step in that process matters. So the basic process runs through the following steps. First, we begin with research, and that may be reading books and articles. It may mean talking to users and customers. It may mean experimenting and trying stuff yourself. And the whole objective is to gather information on the overall space. After that, after you research, you're going to define the problem. Because guess what? When you define the problem up front and you haven't done the research, you may not be defining the real problem. The real problem is often difficult to see and may not be the first thing that comes to mind. And so you'll come up with a variety of different ways to define the problem based on the research that you've done. Once you've successfully defined the problem, then what you're going to do is you're going to go ahead and you're going to ideate. In other words, come up with potential solutions. I used to have this process where I'd actually do it on sheets of paper. And on each sheet of paper, I would just try to come up with as many ideas as possible. And I also sometimes had as an exercise pieces of paper with verbs on it, things like inside out, reverse, upside down, to allow me to think about the problem from different angles. And I would just come up with potential solution after potential solution. Many of these solutions would be terrible, but that's the nature of brainstorming. You're supposed to come up with ideas, as many as possible, without casting judgment up front. By the way, at any point in time, as you're doing research or defining the problem, solutions may come into your mind. That's okay. Just go ahead and write those down. If you don't write them down, they're just going to stick in your mind and prevent you from seeing other solutions. So go ahead and write them down. Make sure you have them somewhere. That way your brain will know, hey, that's okay. I don't need to keep thinking about this thing. I can move on to other things as well. After you've ideated on all these problems, then you'll actually go ahead and prototype. You'll actually try them out. And when you're trying them out maybe with low resolution prototypes, maybe a complete exact replica of what you want to do in production. but you're going to go ahead and try to gather as much information as quickly as possible about whether or not your solution works and what about your solution works, because you're probably going to have to refine your solution many times. And in fact, that's where the iteration comes in. You're going to go ahead and iterate after you've gone ahead, you've run a prototype, you've gathered some new information, you probably have some new nuances. You go back and do more research. Then you'll define the problem and redefine it if you discovered some new nuances. Then you're going to ideate, you're going to prototype, and you just keep doing this over and over again until you find a solution that you're comfortable with. And only when you have a solution that you're comfortable with will you shift into that results mode. All this time you've been in learning mode, where the goal is to learn as quickly as possible, as inexpensively as possible. So you're going to be looking at the cost of resources, and you're going to be looking at the cost in terms of calendar days. But then once you get into results mode, what you're really looking to do is to see, okay, well, what is the return on investment? What are the revenues that we generate per inputs that we put in? And there you're looking at outputs and inputs rather than trying to figure out what you've learned.
So something that's counterintuitive is that the activities that you perform when you're in learning mode may be the same activities that you perform when you're in results mode. So an example of something that I've been doing is generating situations, real world situations that I can observe so that I can learn about problems. And the example that I gave you is I matched up one of my friends is a very experienced developer at Google with a computer science student at Princeton. They're doing a coding exercise together. And then based on that situation, I'm going to observe them do their conversation afterwards. And then I'm going to ask them questions based on this real world situation. But in a way that is execution, like that is, offering a service, I guess, and doing something. It's not pure research, but the way in which it is qualitatively different from, let's say, when I was building my last business dedicated, is that I am not trying to get results. I am trying to learn about these people's problems.
That's right. And again, it may be the same thing. Actually, one of the great principles of experimentation is the closer you can get to the real thing, the better. And so, in many ways, it's actually a good thing if the activity during the learning phase is similar to the activity in the results phase. But there are exceptions. So, you just mentioned how you set up an artificial situation. That's because by setting up an artificial situation, you can conduct a perfect experiment. You can make sure you're testing exactly what you're looking for without a whole bunch of other confounding factors. And when you set it up and run it as an experiment yourself, you can also do things like interrupt in the middle of the experiment and say, hey, what's going on? What are you saying? I just noticed you guys did this. What were you thinking? And so there are other ways to learn from an experiment that you wouldn't be able to learn from a production sales process, for example. So, yes, you should actually have activities that are very similar. And in some ways, the more similar, the better. But the key difference is during learning mode, you can interrupt and potentially sacrifice results for the sake of greater learning. Whereas when you're in results mode, you may go ahead and bypass opportunities for learning if you think it's going to deliver the results that you need. Because guess what? In production, as you're scaling up your sales team, your goal is no longer as much about learning. You will say, we've probably learned enough. We may learn some more refinements, but guess what? It's good enough. Right now, we've got to grow. We've got to blitzscale, to go ahead and use one of the terms I helped coin. And therefore, I don't care about learning as much as I care about you guys just getting as many customers in as possible.
So actually, something came to mind that we didn't discuss earlier is, because you talk about blitzscaling here. When do you get to a point where you should be seeking resources that are not just your time externally to help you accelerate? So is it the case that you should be trying to, let's say, fundraise so as to have cash only when you're confident enough that you're going to transition over to results mode? Or should you be fundraising and seeking other resources before that?
So it depends. If you have enough resources on your own to be able to get through the learning period, then you should wait because it'll be far easier to raise money from investors when you can point to them all the learning you've done and that you know what's going to work. It's a lot easier to raise money that way than to say, hey, listen, we don't know what's going to happen. Give us some money so we can find out. So if you can avoid raising money before you've entered the results mode, so much the better. But sometimes that's not possible, in which case you're going to go ahead and raise the money with the understanding of here's what we know, here's what we don't know, here's the learnings that your investment is going to buy us, and that will allow us to begin to scale or to go into results mode.
So when I am in learning mode, right, the way that I should define ROI is, or the R is learning.
Yeah.
And ideally, learning about problems is like the majority of the time is what you're doing, like not necessarily learning about solutions. And then the I, the investment, it can be various resources, but it's primarily going to be calendar days or man hours that you're investing. I'll let you kind of like expand on that.
Yeah, and I think that that's right. So again, there's some implicit assumptions in there. Like in the majority of cases, when you're in learning mode, you may very well be bootstrapping. And so to some extent, the resources are fixed. There's not a lot of them. And so it doesn't really matter. And really the primary constraint ends up being the calendar days because the every day that you do not learn is a day that your competitors might be learning, is a day your competitors might be beating you to the market. And so, one of the things that is very hard, sometimes people say, oh, well, I'm going to bootstrap because then I don't have a ticking clock. I can take as long as is needed to get things right. And I'm like, that's assuming nobody else figures it out. If you've got something that is really valuable and you're trying to learn about it, you should probably assume that somebody else is trying to learn about it too. And you should not be dawdling. You should be trying to proceed to reaching conclusions as quickly as possible. So that's the results and the investment. However, what will happen when you shift over into results mode is you'll be looking for revenue, or you'll be looking for account growth, or you'll be looking for engagement. And then your investment will likely be monetary as well. Because once you raise money to grow, then your burn rate becomes paramount. Before, your burn rate was kind of irrelevant because you didn't have any resources. Now you have a limited period of time in which to show progress before you raise that next round. Because, of course, it may take 6 months to raise a round, and you need to raise money before you actually need it. Otherwise, you're going to run out of cash if anything goes wrong along the way. And things usually do go wrong.
So it's interesting. One of the dynamics I find for myself, and I think it's pretty typical, I've observed with others, is it's really easy to get committed to solutions.
Yes.
Just psychologically,
yes.
I don't know why it's like that.
There's an easy explanation why we're committed to solutions. So that whole period of time when we're in that mode of learning about the problem and ideating and everything like that, that's a lot of uncertainty. That's time where people like you who have this strong work ethic, who think I always have to be productive, I always have to be executing, are saying to themselves, oh my God, I'm falling further and further behind. What am I doing? I got to pick something soon. The pressure is building. Oh my God, Chris just told me that every day that goes by, another competitor is possibly finding the solution. I got to jump on something. And so we naturally have this emotional desire to jump to the solution. But that's not the fastest way to get there. The fastest way to get there is to actually fully understand the problem, come up with a broad set of solutions, and then when you do pick a solution, pick it with confidence that you've gone through a process that allowed you to make a good decision.
So that's kind of the thing. Just like I'm psychologically want to be committed to a solution.
Mm-hmm.
And also just like, and the more I invest in a solution, the more there's like a sunk cost, right?
That's right.
As well. So there's a big element to the research process, or the learning process, which is managing my own psychology.
Absolutely.
And then doing things which accelerate speed tend to make me tend to like make it harder for me to manage my own psychology, right? Like if I'm in kind of like exploratory, take our time mindset, then it's easier to not commit to solutions, for example. How would you think about that dynamic, or it's just like, suck it up?
Well, at the end of the day, that's part of your job as an entrepreneur to manage your own psychology. You got to have a sense of urgency, but you also have to not rush into things. It's encapsulated with the classic John Wooden quote. John Wooden, of course, being the legendary basketball coach of the UCLA men's basketball team, who said, "Be quick, but don't hurry." That sounds like some crazy stuff. Wait a minute, be quick, but don't hurry. And what it means is to act with a sense of urgency, not to dawdle, not to delay, but don't hurry. Don't rush into things. Don't do things without thinking them through. Don't do something just in order to do it.
And probably a key element that is the crux of where I'm going wrong, and I think most people go wrong, is to measure progress not based on how much you're learning about the problem. So think like, oh,
Yes.
right, it's like, hey, I have a good idea. That's good. It's like, no, that's not good. I really understand the problem and the problems of all the people involved. That's what you should be patting yourself on the back for, something like that.
That's right. And that's why understanding that this is an entire process helps. Because you know that if you don't do a good job at the research stage and you don't do a good job at defining the problem stage, you're going to come up with a suboptimal solution. You're going to be better off investing the time in each of those stages. Now, don't dawdle. Don't say, oh, I'm going to take 6 months to do research. You should be able to do it far more quickly than that. So you're going to proceed as quickly as you can, but you're not going to hurry. You're not going to rush without actually going through and doing the work. And if you do that, then you can make your decisions and start your process with a much greater degree of confidence. That still doesn't guarantee success, by the way. If there was some way to guarantee success of startups, boy, I would be the richest man alive. And this is not an answer that will guarantee success, but it's an answer that will give you the best chance of success.
Now, there's a final component here, which is that, and it's something you brought up in our kind of like first conversation, which is there are problems that cannot be solved.
Yes.
Right. And so and the way that you framed it is, and maybe I'm paraphrasing here, but it's like, or I am paraphrasing. It's like, there are problems that just exist, and they're huge problems, and they've always existed. And even if you really understand the problem, well, if there's nothing that's changed in the environment, it's very unlikely that you can solve them.
Correct.
Right? So, like, how do you, that's like the why now, right?
Yeah.
And it's interesting to think of the why now as being related to problems rather than to solutions. But how do you take that into account, especially given the fact that if you don't understand the problem deeply enough, maybe you're not going to see the why now that's related to the problem.
Right. So I do think it all boils down to you have to come up with a hypothesis for why now, and then see whether or not you find that hypothesis believable. Is there evidence to support it? And do you think that's actually going to happen? The example I give is Ustream, which was the live video startup that I helped get off the ground. And with Ustream, people had asked the question, why now? Because the ability to stream video, even live, had existed before. Why would people be willing to stream live? Why would it make a difference? Why would it be a good time? And my answer to that is yes, technology plays a role. Moore's law is reducing the cost of the bandwidth required to stream these videos. And so as a result, we are reaching the point of technological enablement. It's also the case that we said, hey, with the iPhone coming out and with other smartphones coming out, there's going to be a fundamental change in people being able to stream from a phone rather than having to take an image from a webcam. And that will allow people to stream things all the time, as opposed to just having like a GoPro, which is doing recorded stuff. And so that will also be a catalytic factor. But the final factor was, I said, the audience is different. We went from an era where people did not actually produce content. We didn't have a creator economy. We just had people consuming content, to the Web 2.0 era of blogs and Twitter and all these things, where people are in fact able to produce content, and they think of themselves as creators in a way they never thought of themselves as creators before. And then, of course, the final element was Twitter itself, which provided a real-time ability to alert people and market a live stream. So when people asked why now, I had a very long and fairly convincing set of changes that had occurred in the marketplace that were enabling the business. And again, look at each of those. Each of those turned out to be true. The bandwidth argument, 100% true. The creator economy argument, 100% true. The iPhone, smartphone argument, 100% true. The Twitter argument, also true. All of these things ended up being true. And as a result, the why now question was answered successfully.
But if you're not starting from a why now, right? You're starting from a customer problem and then layering on the why now.
Yes. But I didn't start Ustream from the why nows. I didn't say, what can I do what am I going to do that will be successful if smartphones become successful? What am I going to be successful because people are now conditioned to be creators rather than just consumers? That's not how we approached it. In fact, in my case, I found the company and I just had to answer those questions for myself. So I was actually starting from the position of the solution, which is kind of backwards. But, in this case, it was something that was so obviously a good idea that I didn't mind. But if we go back to saying, okay, well, how do we come up with the why now? I think that the why now is something where you're like, okay, here is the problem. It's a big problem. It's an important problem. Why has nobody tried to solve this problem before? And if the answer is, oh, I don't know, then gosh, there's something you're overlooking. There has to be a why now answer, because it can't just be that people are dumb. There is something that's changed in the environment that now enables you to come up with a good solution.
And you should discover that as you learn about, like, you need to understand the problem to a certain level of depth.
Correct.
To discover that.
Correct.
Or to discover that actually there is no why now, and you should just deal with a different problem or a different kind of version of this problem or a different take on it or stuff like that.
Exactly. And, there are all these sort of intractable problems or wicked problems as they're described. And these wicked problems are one where I don't like the answer, oh, it's never worked. That's how venture capitalists often answer these questions. Oh, that's never worked. We've tried that before. It doesn't work. I'm like, no, that's not enough of an answer. You've got to provide some thoughts on it. So one of these wicked problems is the problem of micropayments. So micropayments and the concept of micropayments has been around for decades. And people have always said, hey, now is the time to look at micropayments. And I remember this in the dot-com era. I remember this in the Web 2.0 era. And now we were just looking at a company the other day that was doing micropayments for video content. And the question is, why doesn't this work? And the answer can't just be, well, because it hasn't ever worked in the past. That's not a real answer. The answer has to be, okay, well, what is it that makes it so that the micropayments don't work? Theory number one, too much friction in the process. Okay, you can probably come up with some pretty low friction ways of doing things. That's how most people have focused their time and energy on the micropayments problem. They've tried to come up with a way to reduce the friction, whether it's a subscription or a very simple one-click button or what have you. But I don't think that's it. I think that the problem is a psychological problem of cognitive load. People don't want to make all of these decisions along the way. And as a result, they are unwilling, even though they claim that they would pay for things, they really don't run into things that often where they would actually pay. And in fact, bundling is the answer, right? Bundling in the sense of, the reason we still have channels on television and streaming services is the issue of bundling. So with micropayments, I'm like, if somebody comes up with a why now, for why suddenly it will be frictionless, but more importantly, why the cognitive load will have gone away, Maybe the AI is deciding for us which things to pay for and which things not to pay for. Or the AI is telling us, hey, you've looked at 7 of these articles. You would probably be better off just paying. Then maybe that will be the catalytic factor. I don't know, but someone's got to come up with something to explain it that's better than just, oh, it's never worked before.
And should the why now be, because when I hear you talk about this, sounds like the why now is related to the solution, not to the problem. So, for example, the problem could be, well, the why now could be
Correct. The
people used to
problem
not
is all,
need to make micropayments, now they do for this reason.
yeah. The problem, so that can exist, right? It can be either. The why now might be the problem only exists because of this. And a great example of this would be, you know, why would anyone have built a business around external battery packs before the rise of smartphones? So the rise of smartphones created a problem. These things don't have enough battery. I now need to have an external battery pack. And the entire business of Mophie is based on this. So there are clearly examples where the why now comes from the problem. But the why now can also come on the solution side. This problem has existed from time immemorial, but now we finally have a way to solve it.
Well, this has been super insightful and immediately actionable for me because it's something that's top of mind.
Awesome.
So Chris, thank you for your time. I want to thank the audience for tuning in. Thank our team, Shlok and Jeremy, for making all this possible. And then I never do this, but I should, just if you're on YouTube, make sure to like our video. And if you're on podcast, please subscribe and leave comments, etc.
And tell a friend.
Yes. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you so much, Julien.
Cool. You know, the last thing we did like this got, I think, 250 views in a week.
Excellent.
So I'm not sure why. Like that's actually pretty good.
Yeah. Well, we're picking up momentum. I would also say one of the interesting paradoxes is this, which is that, of course, I think bringing in guests that are famous gets people's attention. But I think that the greater insights come from these conversations because we're diving much deeper on a single thing. When we bring in the guest, we have to necessarily do things like, get to know them as a human being and learn about their business. And then we can proceed from there to extract a few lessons. But here we can just concentrate the entire time on a single lesson.
Well, so the way that we've been thinking about it, and this is kind of what Jeremy brought up in a certain way, is the guests are our go-to-market.
Yeah.
So the way people discover us is through the guests. So let's say we'll have Roberto, your LP, on, and then there'll be some.
And Roberto's company will say, hey, our LP Roberto was on Blitzscaling yourself. Check it out. And publicize it. And I mean, that's really the mechanism of action. It's not just that there are a bunch of people out there with Google alerts for the names of our guests.
Correct.
It's that our guests themselves have followings.
Promote it. Yeah.
Yeah.
So then, Dan Lewis promoted it, and his episode got 500 views in a week because people looked at it. Yeah. And then what they'll do is be like, well, this is an interesting interview with Dan. I wonder what this podcast is. They'll look at it. Yeah. And then they see, oh, these are really interesting conversations. So then, the actual product is this.
Yes.
While the interviews are the go-to-market.
Yes. And by the way, I mean, I think that this is not reinventing the wheel. People have done this for podcasts all over the place. So something like, Conan O'Brien, for example, wildly successful, has just made a huge pile of money being sold essentially to Spotify. And in his case, he has these celebrity guests on, and that's clearly the thing that brings people on. But they're also very careful to have all of this banter with his team, his producer and his assistant. And that actually takes up a significant chunk of the programming. And it is actually one of the things that builds the greatest loyalty because you have characters that the audience gets to know and love. And of course, they can get to know and love a guest. And of course, they're always excited whenever, say, Jeff Goldblum comes on, but he can only come on every so often.
Yeah. And so what Schloke is pushing us to do, he's actually changing it. I'm not sure. I just emailed him to get his take on what I should do differently. But so I'm doing updates on my kind of like journey, building the business. And then I do advisory sessions with you.
Yep.
And then, we also have the guest interviews that are there, but they're mostly the go-to-market.
Yeah.
So yeah,
it's real. I think it fits together pretty well. And again, remains to be seen, right? We are still in learning mode. Again, not yet results mode. So it makes sense. We'll be in results mode when Spotify has given us $50 million and we feel like we have to earn the earnout.
I will let you go. We're 30 minutes over, and I'll hit the end